The invoice hit the concrete floor the second she let it go. $199. 4 hours of work. Brett Callaway's hands were still dark with grease when Claudia Mercer dropped that paper like it was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "You think I'm paying this?" Her voice carried across the lot. Sharp, certain, built for rooms where no one talks back. She turned to the small crowd gathering near the garage entrance and said it plainly that Brett was running a scam, that the number was inflated, that she wouldn't be fooled by some small-town mechanic with dirty hands and invented fees. Brett stood still. The paper lay at his feet. She got back into her flawless silver SUV, the one he had just brought back from the dead, and pulled out of the lot without a backward glance. That night her father made a phone call Brett knew nothing about. By morning, nothing would be the same. The town of Ashford wasn't the kind of place that made it onto maps people actually used. It sat between two larger cities like a comma. No one noticed a single main road, a diner that had been serving the same pie recipe since the 1980s, and a row of small businesses that had learned to survive by being genuinely useful rather than flashy. Callaway Auto sat at the far end of that row. The sign above the garage door had faded to the point where the second L in Callaway was more suggestion than letter. The concrete floor inside was stained with 20 years of oil and effort. 2 hydraulic lifts, a wall of hand tools, organized with the kind of quiet obsessiveness that comes from working alone, and a small office in the back where Brett kept his invoices, his coffee maker, and a photograph of his daughter taped above the desk. Sadie, 9 years old, missing her 2 front teeth in the photo, grinning like the world owed her nothing, and she was fine with that. Brett had put that photo up 3 years ago, right around the time everything else came down. He didn't talk about his wife much, not because the grief had passed, but because it hadn't, and there was no version of that conversation that made the next hour easier to get through. So he got through hours the only way he knew, with his hands, under hoods, inside engines, finding the thing that was broken and making it work again. That was what he did. That was what he had always done. The regulars in Ashford knew Brett's name before they knew his face. Word traveled the way it does in small towns, not through advertising, but through trust. Old Mr. Patterson had told his neighbor. His neighbor had told her sister. Her sister had driven 40 minutes from the next county because someone she trusted said Brett Callaway wouldn't overcharge her and wouldn't pretend a problem existed just to pad a bill. He had built the business on that. Piece by piece, year by year, customer by customer. But the last 8 months had been different. A regional auto service chain had opened a location 6 blocks away, glossy signage, digital check-in kiosks, a waiting room with a coffee machine that made drinks with Italian names. They ran discount promotions every other week. They had a loyalty app. They sponsored the local high school football team. Brett had none of those things. What he had was a hydraulic lift that needed a new seal, an electricity bill 30 days past due, and a letter from the bank sitting in his desk drawer that he had read twice, and then turned face down, as if not seeing the words would delay what they meant. He had stopped letting Sadie see him open the mail. On the morning that changed everything, Brett had been in the garage since 7. A pickup truck with a busted alternator, a sedan with brake pads worn to almost nothing, and a delivery van whose owner had called 3 times already to ask if it was ready. Brett had moved between all 3 without stopping the kind of focused efficiency that comes not from energy, but from necessity. Too much to do too few hours, no room for anything to go wrong. He was washing his hands at the utility sink when he heard it. Tires. Fast. The crunch of gravel, and then the hard stop that meant someone had braked later than they should have. Brett turned to see a silver SUV pulling into the lot, expensive, the kind of vehicle whose price tag could have kept his garage running for 2 years. The woman behind the wheel had the particular expression of someone accustomed to inconveniences being resolved quickly and by other people. She stepped out in a charcoal blazer and heels that had no business being anywhere near a garage floor. She stood just inside the entrance, close enough to be out of the sun, but not far enough in to suggest she was comfortable with the surroundings. "I need this looked at now," she said. Not a question. Brett dried his hands on the shop rag tucked into his back pocket. "What's it doing?" Temperature gauge went into the red on the highway. "I have a meeting in 2 hours. He looked at the SUV, then back at her. "I'll take a look." Her name he would learn from the registration paperwork she handed over, with the kind of impatience usually reserved for slow waitstaff, was Claudia Mercer. The name meant nothing to him. He didn't follow business news or read the profiles of regional executives. He just saw an overheating engine and a woman who needed to be somewhere. He popped the hood. The coolant reservoir was nearly empty. The upper radiator hose had a hairline crack running along its underside, small enough to miss on a casual inspection, significant enough to have pushed the engine toward dangerous temperatures on an extended highway drive. Brett traced the length of the hose with 2 fingers, confirmed the crack, and checked the surrounding components for any secondary damage. Everything else looked clean. He walked back to where Claudia was standing near the entrance phone pressed to her ear, making arrangements for something that sounded important. Brett waited until she lowered the phone. "Cracked radiator hose," he said. "I'll replace it, flush and refill the coolant, run the engine through a full temperature cycle to make sure nothing else is compromised. You'll be good." Claudia looked at him the way she might look at a contractor explaining the specifics of a plumbing repair present, but not particularly interested. "How long?" 2.5 hours, maybe 3. "I told you I have a meeting." "I understand that," Brett said. "But if you drive it as is, you risk warping the cylinder head. That's a different conversation, and a much more expensive one." Something in his tone, not aggressive, just factual, seemed to register. Claudia looked at the SUV, then back at him. "Fine," she said. "Fix it." She spent most of the next 3 hours at the small bench near the garage entrance, working from her phone, occasionally stepping outside to take calls in the privacy of the parking lot. Brett worked steadily the way he always did. No shortcuts, no guessing. He replaced the hose, flushed the old coolant out completely refilled with fresh fluid, and ran the engine for 40 minutes, while monitoring the temperature gauge to confirm the fix had held. It held. He wiped down the engine compartment, lowered the hood, and walked to the office to write up the invoice. Parts plus labor. $199. He had calculated it the same way he calculated every job what the parts actually cost, what the time was genuinely worth. Nothing invented, nothing inflated. He walked the invoice out to Claudia. She took it, read it. And then something shifted in her face, not surprise at the number, but something else. Something that looked in retrospect like a decision being made. "What is this?" she said. "Invoice for the repair," Brett said. "Parts and labor. This is $199 for a garden hose and some water." Her voice had climbed slightly, not in pitch, but in projection, the way people speak when they want to be heard by more than the person in front of them. Brett kept his voice even. "It's a radiator hose, not a garden hose. And the labor covers. I know what labor covers." Claudia turned slightly toward the 2 customers who had drifted to the edge of the lot, drawn by the shift in atmosphere. "This is exactly what I've heard about places like this. You see a car you don't recognize, and you invent a number." "The number is what it costs," Brett said. "I'm not paying it." The words landed flat. Brett looked at her. He thought about the 30-day past due electricity bill. He thought about the bank letter sitting face down in his drawer. He thought about Sadie at school right now, completely unaware that her father was standing in a gravel parking lot, being called a thief in front of his own customers. He could argue. He had every right to argue. The work was done. The repair was solid, and the price was fair by any standard. He could prove it line by line if someone asked. But something about the way Claudia was standing, the angle of her chin, the steadiness of her voice, the calm certainty of a person who had never once lost this kind of standoff, told Brett that arguing would only give her more runway. She wasn't confused about the invoice. She wasn't worried about being wrong. She was simply choosing not to pay, and she had decided that her version of events would be the one that stuck. Brett reached down and picked up the invoice from where she had dropped it on the concrete. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket. "Drive safe," he said. Claudia Mercer got back into her silver SUV. The engine turned over cleanly, quietly, the way a well-repaired engine does. She reversed out of the lot without looking back, and the sound of her tires faded down the main road until it was gone. The two customers near the lot drifted away. The teenager who had been sweeping the far end of the parking lot leaned his broom against the wall and looked at Brett with the uncertain expression of someone who had witnessed something and wasn't sure what to do with it. Brett walked back into the garage. He stood at the utility sink and washed his hands again, even though they didn't particularly need it. The water ran gray for a moment and then clear. He dried them on the shop rag. He hung the rag back on its hook. Then he sat down at his desk, moved the face-down bank letter to the side, without flipping it over, and looked at the photograph of Sadie. The garage around him was quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from an absence of noise, but from a presence of something unspoken. Brett had built this place on the understanding that if you did good work and charged a fair price, you earned the right to keep going. It was a simple equation. He had believed in it completely. He pulled the folded invoice from his shirt pocket and set it on the desk. $199. He stared at it for a long time. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting, pulling long shadows across the gravel lot, where Claudia Mercer's tire tracks were still fresh in the dust. By the time Brett finally stood up, locked the front gate, and drove to pick up Sadie from school, those tracks would be gone. But the evening was just beginning, and 40 miles away, in a house that bore no resemblance to a garage in a fading town, a man named Walter Mercer was sitting down to dinner, and his daughter was about to tell him about her day. Sadie was waiting on the front steps of Ashford Elementary, with her backpack straps pulled tight and her lunchbox dangling from 2 fingers, the way she always carried it when it was empty. She spotted Brett's truck before he had fully pulled into the pickup lane and lifted one hand in a wave that was somehow both casual and enthusiastic at the same time. She climbed in, dropped her lunchbox on the floor, and started talking before the door was fully closed. She told him about a science project involving paper bridges and how much weight they could hold before collapsing. She told him that her friend Lily had worn mismatched shoes by accident and decided to make it a fashion statement. She told him that the cafeteria had served something described as pasta, but which she was fairly certain was not pasta. Brett listened. He asked the right questions. He laughed in the right places. He was good at this, at being fully present for her, even when something heavy was sitting in the back of his chest. He had learned to do it after her mother died, out of necessity first, and then out of love. Sadie didn't need to carry his weight on top of her own. She was 9. Her biggest problem today had been structurally unsound paper bridges, and Brett wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. They stopped at the grocery store on the way home. Sadie picked out a box of macaroni and cheese with the focus of someone making an important decision. Brett added a rotisserie chicken from the deli case and a bag of frozen peas that neither of them particularly liked, but that he bought every week out of some vague commitment to vegetables. Dinner was easy. The kitchen was warm. Sadie set the table without being asked, which she only did when she sensed something was off. She had always been perceptive in a way that made Brett simultaneously proud and heartbroken. They ate. They talked about the paper bridge. Brett told her that the strongest bridge designs distribute weight across multiple points instead of concentrating it in one place, and Sadie looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when something her father said turned out to be actually useful. After dinner, Brett washed the dishes while Sadie finished her homework at the kitchen table. When she went to bed, she left something beside her empty plate, without saying a word about it, a torn corner of notebook paper folded once. Brett found it after her lamp was already off and her door was already closed. He unfolded it at the kitchen sink. 6 words in slightly uneven handwriting. Dad is the best dad in the world. Things will get better. He stood there for a moment with the water still running. Then he folded the note carefully and put it in his shirt pocket right where the invoice had been earlier that afternoon. He drove back to the garage. He did this sometimes, came back after hours when it was quiet, when no customers were waiting and no phones were ringing, and the only thing in the building was the work itself. He told himself he came back to catch up on paperwork. That was partially true. But mostly he came back because the garage was the one place where problems had definable edges. An engine either ran or it didn't. A brake line either held pressure or it didn't. You could find the fault, address it, and confirm it was resolved. The stack of invoices on his desk did not operate on the same principle. He sat down, moved his cold coffee to the side, and went through the numbers the way he did at the end of every difficult week, methodically, without flinching, even when flinching would have felt better. The electricity bill, the equipment lease, the supplier account that was 60 days out, the note from the bank which he finally turned face up and read a 3rd time slowly, as if reading it more carefully might change what it said. It didn't. The deadline was 1 week away. The amount was not catastrophic on paper, but it was unreachable given what was currently sitting in the business account. He would need the next 7 days to be very good days, and the last 8 months had not produced many of those. Brett leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The photograph of Sadie was above the desk, slightly crooked, the tape at the upper left corner, beginning to peel. He had meant to retape it for 2 months. He looked at her grinning face, that specific grin, the one that showed the gaps where her front teeth had been, and reached into his shirt pocket for the folded note she had left him. He read it again. Set it on the desk beside the bank letter. Then he turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing in the smell of oil and metal and the particular silence of a garage at night. At a certain point, the possibility he had been holding at arm's length moved closer. Not a plan, not a decision, just a shape he could no longer pretend wasn't there what it would mean to close. The equipment, the tools on the wall, the hydraulic lifts, the photograph, whether he would take it down first or last, what he would say to Sadie. He locked up at 11:40 and drove home without having answered any of it. The Mercer house sat behind a private gate on the north side of the city, not ostentatious in the way that new money tends to be, but quietly, definitively expensive. The kind of property that announced its worth through restraint. A long gravel drive lined with mature oak's exterior lighting that illuminated without drawing attention a front door that had been custom-made and showed it. Walter Mercer had lived there for 19 years. He had bought it after his second major exit and had changed almost nothing about it since, because he had grown up in a house where the windows didn't fit the frames and the heating only worked in 2 rooms, and he had learned early that comfort, when you finally earned it, was not something to renovate away. He was 72 years old. He had built 3 companies from nothing, sold 2 of them, and still held a quiet ownership stake in more than a dozen others. His name appeared occasionally in financial publications, and almost never anywhere else, because Walter had made a deliberate choice decades ago to operate with as little public surface area as possible. He ate dinner at 7. Always. Claudia arrived at 6:55 and joined him at the long table in the dining room, where 2 places were already set and the food was already plated. She had been stopping by for Tuesday dinners since she moved back to the city 4 years ago to take the CEO position at the firm her father had helped fund in its early days. It was one of the few regular things in both their schedules. She told him about the day while they ate, the meeting she'd had to reschedule, the board call that had run long, and then, almost as an afterthought, the incident at the garage in Ashford. She kept the telling light. Minor irritation, nothing more. A small-town mechanic with an inflated invoice and enough nerve to push back. Walter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his fork. "Did he fix the car?" Walter asked. Claudia looked across the table at him. "Yes. And the temperature gauge, it's reading normally now." "It's fine." Walter picked up his fork again, cut a small piece of chicken, and did not eat it immediately. Was $199 an unreasonable price for the repair? The dining room was very quiet. Claudia straightened slightly in her chair. "That's not really the point. I'm asking if the price was unreasonable," Walter said. His voice was the same temperature it always was. Not cold, not warm, just level. The voice of a man who had asked thousands of questions and learned that the answer usually arrived faster when you didn't add pressure to the asking. Claudia's jaw tightened just slightly. "No," she said. It wasn't unreasonable. Walter nodded once and ate the piece of chicken. He didn't say anything else about it at dinner. He asked about the Q3 projections she had mentioned the previous week. He asked if she had taken any time off recently, which was his way of telling her she looked tired. He walked her to the front door at 8:30 and stood on the step while she got into her car. He watched the taillights disappear down the drive. Then he went to his study, sat down at the desk where he had made every significant decision of the last 3 decades, and opened his laptop. He typed, "Brett Callaway. Callaway Auto. Ashford." What Walter found did not come quickly or easily, and that in itself told him something. There was no website for Callaway Auto beyond a basic business listing. No social media presence. No local news features about the garage or its owner. What Walter found instead were the traces people leave when they're not trying to leave any reviews on platforms Brett had never signed up for, posted by customers who had taken it upon themselves to record their experience somewhere. Walter read through them slowly. A woman named Patricia had written that Brett had driven her car to her house after the repair because she had no one to pick her up, and the walk was 3 miles. He had refused the extra payment she offered. A retired teacher had left a note saying Brett had identified a brake problem during a routine oil change and fixed it for the cost of parts, only because the man had mentioned offhand that he was on a fixed income. There was a short entry from someone who signed their name only as D. Marlowe that said Brett had quietly paid for a tow for a family stranded on the highway on Christmas Eve, and that he had done it anonymously. They had only found out months later through someone else. Walter leaned back in his chair. He picked up his phone and called a man named Gary Pruitt, who had grown up in Ashford and still had family there. Walter had known Gary for 30 years through a business deal that had started as a transaction and become something closer to friendship. It was after 9. Gary answered on the 3rd ring. "Tell me about a mechanic in your hometown," Walter said. "Brett Callaway." Gary was quiet for a moment on the other end, not from surprise, but from consideration, the way people get when they're trying to figure out where to start. "Brett's the real thing," Gary said finally. "Most people in town don't even know the half of what he does. He's been sending school supplies to Ashford Elementary every fall for years, drops it off through the PTA anonymously. My cousin works there. She only figured out it was him because she recognized his handwriting on an envelope once." Gary paused for a moment. "And that's just the thing she happened to catch. There are probably a dozen others nobody ever traced back to him." Walter let Gary talk. He didn't ask many questions. He just listened the way he had always listened, when what he needed was the truth rather than a particular answer. By the time he set down the phone, it was past 10:30. Walter sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. He had grown up without money, which meant he had grown up watching how people behaved when they thought no one of consequence was paying attention. He had built his career on the belief that character, real character, not the performed kind, was the scarcest and most valuable thing a person could possess. He had found very little of it over the years, in the places people usually looked for it. He opened a new window on his laptop and began drafting a note to his personal attorney. Brett opened the garage the next morning at 7:15. The routine was the same as every morning: unlock the front gate, raise the main door switch on the overhead lights, start the coffee maker in the back office. Check the appointment book. 2 cars scheduled, 1 drop-off confirmed, 1 still unconfirmed. Pull the first vehicle into the bay. He worked through the early morning the way he always did, methodically, without hurry, letting the rhythm of the work settle him the way it always had. At 9 o'clock, he went to the office to refill his coffee. He set down the mug, moved a parts catalog off the corner of the desk, and there it was underneath the bank letter face up, now the way he'd left it the night before. Beside it, Sadie's folded note still in the same spot where he'd set it down. He picked up the bank letter. He read it one more time. Then he set it back down and picked up his coffee mug instead. He stood in the doorway between the office and the garage, looking out at the vehicle on the lift, a 10-year-old sedan with a transmission that needed new fluid and a filter that was long overdue. Ordinary work. Honest work. The kind of job that paid a modest amount and took exactly the skill it took and would leave someone driving a safer car by the end of the afternoon. He drained the last of his coffee, set the mug on the corner of the desk, and walked back out to the lift. He was reaching for a wrench when he heard tires on gravel. Not fast this time. Slow and deliberate, the sound of a driver who knew exactly where he was going and wasn't in any particular hurry to announce it. Brett straightened and turned toward the open garage door. A long black sedan pulled into the lot. It moved with the quiet weight of a very well-made vehicle and stopped in the center of the gravel precisely the way people park when they're used to having space. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was in his 70s, silver-haired, wearing a plain dark jacket over a collared shirt. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had never needed to take up more space than he occupied. He looked around the garage entrance, once not assessing, just orienting, and then walked directly toward Brett. He stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. "Mr. Callaway," he said. "My name is Walter Mercer. I was hoping we could talk." Brett wiped his hand on the shop rag before shaking Walter's. It was reflex, the automatic courtesy of a man who spent his days covered in grease and had learned early that not everyone wanted to share that. Walter shook his hand firmly, and without hesitation, the way people do when they've worked with their hands before and remember what it felt like. "Mr. Mercer," Brett said. The name had registered the moment Walter said it. Not because Brett followed business news, but because Claudia's last name had been on the registration paperwork he'd held in his hands the previous afternoon. The connection was immediate and uncomfortable, like touching a wire he hadn't expected to be live. Walter looked at the garage around them, the tools on the wall, the sedan on the lift, the oil-stained floor that had been swept clean down the center lane. He took it in the way someone does when they're reading something, not just looking at it. "I'd like to hear about yesterday," Walter said. "From your side." Brett studied the older man for a moment. There was nothing performative about him, no impatience, no agenda visible on his face. He just stood there in the middle of the garage and waited with the particular patience of someone who had learned that most things reveal themselves if you give them enough room. "Come on back," Brett said. They sat in the small office, Walter in the spare chair that Brett usually piled with catalogs, Brett behind the desk. Brett moved the bank letter to the side without thinking, then thought about it, and left it where it was. Sadie's note stayed where it was two-folded at the corner of the desk. He told Walter what had happened. He didn't editorialize. He described the repair, the invoice, what Claudia had said, and how she had said it, and what he had done afterward. He kept his voice flat, and his account precise, the way he described mechanical problems. "This is what I found. This is what I did. This is what happened next." When he finished, the office was quiet. Walter nodded slowly. "The price was fair," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Brett said. "And you chose not to argue with her." Brett looked at the desk for a moment. Arguing wasn't going to get me anywhere. She'd already decided. Walter held his gaze. "I owe you an apology on behalf of my family. What happened here was wrong. I want to be straightforward with you about that before anything else." Brett looked at him. He had expected many things from this conversation. A check for $199 maybe. An awkward attempt at damage control. What he had not expected was this: a man in his 70s, sitting in a folding chair in a two-bay garage in Ashford, and leading with an apology that sounded like he actually meant it. "I appreciate that," Brett said. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew an envelope. It was a standard white business envelope sealed with nothing written on the outside. He set it on the desk in front of Brett. "I'd like you to open that," Walter said. Brett looked at the envelope. He picked it up, worked the flap open with his thumb, and pulled out a single folded document. It was a certified check. Brett unfolded it, read the number, read it again. $19 million. The office was very small. The overhead fluorescent light hummed the way it always hummed. Outside, a car passed on the main road, slowed for the intersection, and continued on. Brett was aware of all of these things with unusual clarity, the way you notice the texture of ordinary life when something extraordinary lands in the middle of it. He set the check down on the desk. "I don't understand," he said. Walter leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees. "I've spent a lot of years watching how people behave," he said. "Not the version they perform for an audience, the version that exists when they think no one's keeping score. That version is almost always the true one." He nodded toward the check. "What I found out about you last night, Mr. Callaway, the things you've done in this town that you never attached your name to, that's the version I'm talking about." Brett was very still. "The school supplies sent anonymously every fall," Walter continued. "The family on the highway on Christmas Eve. The brake job you did for the retired teacher at cost, because he mentioned he was on a fixed income. The other things Gary Pruitt told me about, the ones nobody ever officially confirmed because you made sure there was nothing to confirm." Walter's voice didn't change temperature as he said these things. He wasn't performing generosity or sentiment. He was simply reporting what he had found, the way you report facts. "Nobody asked you to do any of that. Nobody was watching. You did it because it was the right thing, and for no other reason." Brett's eyes moved to the folded note at the corner of the desk. "Those weren't grand gestures," he said quietly. "They were just what needed doing." "I know," Walter said. "That's exactly why I'm here." He explained it plainly without ceremony. The check wasn't charity. It wasn't a settlement or an apology payment, or an attempt to neutralize what Claudia had done with a large number. It was an investment from a private fund Walter had maintained for years, quietly for exactly this kind of purpose. He had deployed it fewer than a dozen times in his life. He had criteria that he had never written down because they were not the kind of criteria that translated well to paper genuine integrity, demonstrated over time in the absence of an audience, the practical ability to do more good with resources than without them. "I'm not giving you this money to change who you are," Walter said. "I'm giving it to you because of who you already are." Brett didn't say anything for a moment. The check sat on the desk between them. $19 million rendered in neat, printed figures, utterly incongruous next to the bank letter and the cold coffee mug and the folded invoice for $199. He thought about Sadie at the kitchen table last night, setting it without being asked, watching him with those careful eyes. He thought about the note she had left, the one now sitting folded at the corner of the desk, 6 words in slightly uneven handwriting. Brett looked at Walter. "What if I told you? I don't know what to do with $19 million. Walter almost smiled. I'd say that's probably a good sign. He stood slowly with the deliberateness of a man who had learned not to rush his body. I'd also say that, based on what I've seen, you'll figure it out. He buttoned his jacket. He glanced once more around the office, the tools visible through the doorway, the photograph above the desk, the neat wall calendar, with appointments penciled in, and then he extended his hand again. Brett stood and shook it. One more thing, Walter said. Claudia knows I'm here. I want you to know that. Brett met his eyes. She's not the same person she was yesterday afternoon, Walter said. I won't pretend one conversation changes everything, but she's thinking. Sometimes that's where it starts. He walked out through the garage past the sedan still waiting on the lift and out into the morning light. The long black sedan started quietly and rolled back down the gravel drive. Brett stood in the garage doorway and watched it go. Then he went back to his desk, sat down and looked at the check for a long time. He called his attorney that afternoon, a woman named Sandra Cole, who had handled the paperwork when he'd originally purchased the garage and whom he had not needed to call since. She was professional and thorough, and managed to keep her voice almost entirely neutral when he told her the figure involved, which Brett appreciated. The process took several weeks. There were verifications and transfers and conversations with Walter's legal team that Brett mostly didn't understand, and trusted Sandra to translate. He kept coming to the garage every morning at 7:15. He kept working on the cars that needed working on. He told Sadie only that some good news had come through, and that things were going to be okay, and she looked at him for a long moment with those careful eyes, and then said, I know, with the absolute serenity of someone who had always believed it. He retaped the corner of her photograph. When the funds were fully cleared, Brett made a list. He had never made a list like this before, not of problems to solve, but of things he wanted to build. The garage came first. He paid off every outstanding debt, replaced the aging hydraulic lift on the left bay, and brought the electrical system up to code in a single week of contracted work that he oversaw personally. He hired 2 mechanics, both of them. Young, both of them. From Ashford, one of whom had been working at the regional chain across town because it was the only place that had offered him a job. Then he set up the fund. He worked with Sandra to structure it properly. The Callaway Emergency Repair Fund, no announcement, no press release, no ribbon cutting, just a mechanism through which families in Ashford and the surrounding county who couldn't afford critical vehicle repairs could get them done at Callaway Auto at no cost. Transportation was not a luxury in a town without reliable public transit. Brett had seen enough people lose jobs because their car died, and they had no way to fix it to understand exactly what that cost them. He also paid off the remaining mortgage on a property belonging to a widow named Ruth Halsey, whose late husband had been a regular customer for 11 years. He set up an anonymous account to cover vehicle maintenance for 3 veterans in the county, who Brett knew were getting by on fixed incomes and aging trucks. He did these things quietly through Sandra, without attaching his name. He was not trying to be anonymous. He was just not interested in the version of generosity that required an audience. Claudia called him 6 weeks after her father's visit. Brett was under a pickup truck when his phone rang. He rolled out, checked the screen, and sat on the edge of the creeper for a moment before answering. "Mr. Callaway," she said. Her voice was different from the way he remembered it. Not softer, exactly, but stripped of that particular certainty. "I'm not going to ask you to accept an apology over the phone. I don't think that's something you do over the phone." A beat passed on the line. "But I wanted you to know that what I did was wrong. Not just tactically wrong, actually wrong. And I've been sitting with that." Brett looked at the underside of the pickup truck. A small oil seep near the rear main seal. He'd need to address that before the end of the day. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "I heard what my father did," Claudia said. "I had nothing to do with that decision. I want you to know that too." "I know," Brett said. "He told me." Another quiet stretch. "I think," Claudia said slowly, "that I'd gotten used to a version of the world where I could make a call like that, and it wouldn't cost me anything. And then it did. And then I had to look at why I'd made it in the first place. Brett didn't offer her absolution. That wasn't his to give, and he suspected she knew it, that she hadn't called expecting it. She had called because she needed to say the thing out loud to the person it had been done to, and that was something he understood. "Good luck, Ms. Mercer," he said, and he meant it. Ashford didn't change overnight. Towns don't. But things shifted, the way things shift, when something true becomes visible that had previously been invisible. The Callaway Emergency Repair Fund got its first family in the third week, a woman named Deborah, whose minivan had a blown head gasket, and who had been taking the bus to her second job for 3 weeks while she tried to figure out how to pay for it. Brett fixed the van in a day. When Deborah came to pick it up and asked what she owed, Brett showed her a zero-balance invoice and told her the fund had covered it. She stood in the garage entrance and cried briefly, and then composed herself with the practicality of someone who didn't have time to be undone for long. Brett handed her the keys. Word moved the way it always moves in small towns, quietly, person to person. Slower than the internet, but more durable. More families came. Brett hired a third mechanic. The waiting list for regular service grew, because people who had drifted to the regional chain started coming back, not because of anything Brett advertised, but because of what they heard. The sign above the garage door still had the faded second L. Brett kept meaning to fix it, and kept not getting around to it. He had a theory that it didn't hurt anything to leave a few things imperfect, in a place that was otherwise running well. It kept you honest about where you were. Every morning he unlocked the gate, raised the main door, switched on the overhead lights, and started the coffee maker in the back office. He looked at the photograph above the desk, retaped now all 4 corners secure, and then he walked out into the garage and got to work. On the wall beside the office door, mounted in a simple frame, was a small piece of torn notebook paper. The handwriting was slightly uneven. The message was 6 words. "Dad is the best dad in the world. Things will get better." Sadie had been right. She usually was.